Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Dani Rodrik. I'm a professor here at the Kennedy School. I'm delighted to be hosting Chancel here, who is going to be starting us off this year. This is a talk that is organized and sponsored by the Inequality and Social Policy Program at the Wiener Center, and it's part of the center's James M. and Kathleen D. Stone PhD Scholars Initiative, which seeks to advance research and discussion on income inequality, wealth inequality, with a particular focus on the causes and consequences of concentration at the very top of the distribution. We're especially grateful to have Chancel here because he and his team have done more than anybody else in terms of putting together an evidentiary basis, an empirical base for our discussions on inequality. And he will be discussing the World Inequality Report 2018. And this is a product of the World Inequality Lab, which he co-directs along with a number of his collaborators. That's on that slide. Many of you may have been here at Thomas Piketty's talk last spring, which was actually the inaugural Stone program event. And this is a chance for Lucas to delve deeper into the data and the evidence and look more carefully at trends both within countries and across countries. Lucas is an economist who based in Paris. In addition to his duties with the World Inequality Lab and this report, he teaches at Sciences Po, also at the Paris School of Economics. His interests obviously are in inequality, but also has been doing research, fundamental research on environmental sustainability and its links to inequality. He has a new book that has been already published in French, I believe. It's called Unsustainable Inequalities, and that book is being translated into English and will be published by Harvard University Press later this year or early next. So the format for the talk is I'm going to give the floor to Lucas. He'll have about half an hour, and then for about 20 minutes, he and I will have a conversation, or rather I'll be asking questions, and he will be providing some discussion and answers and going deeper at some of the points. And then we'll open it up for questions and comments and discussion from the floor. So, Lucas?
So, yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation, Dani, to the Inequality and Social Policy program to invite and host this talk. So I'm here as a general coordinator of this report, which was also coordinated by Facundo Alvarado, Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zuckman. And so basically the premise of this work is that economic inequality, whether within countries or between countries, if it is not properly addressed, well, it can lead to various sorts of political, social, economic, even environmental catastrophes. The problem is that we live in a world that is characterized by deep opacity of inequality data because of the nature of the financial system, because of the tools and the methods that many official statistical institutions have been using over the past decades, because of the lack of willingness of certain governments to actually publish and produce inequality data. So this leads to a very poor state of knowledge about global inequality dynamics. Now, a lot of progresses have been made over the past decade, but we still know very little. And in fact, this may lead to a lot of public discourse focusing and perhaps reusing preconceived ideas on globalization and inequality. Some of these preconceived ideas or sticky ideas may go on like this. So first, the idea that there has been a reduction of global inequalities between individuals since the 1980s, thanks to strong growth in the emerging world. A second idea is that trickle-down works. So basically, the higher growth at the top, the higher growth at the bottom. And you need high growth at the top to have high growth at the bottom of your distribution. Third idea, there is no serious alternative to rising inequality within countries because it's essentially due to technology and to trade, and there's nothing much we can do about it. So one of the purposes of this report is to objectivize these questions and to put on the table open, transparent, standardized data that span over 40 years. So a few words about the process. This report is based on WIDWorld, the World Inequality Database, which was initiated in 2011. I'll have a few words on this later. We see it as the most extensive database on the historical evolution of income and wealth. And the project actually relies on more than 100 researchers over the world. One of the key objectives beyond actually or perhaps before the analysis of the trends is really to put all this data online on an open source platform in a way that's 100% transparent and reproducible, which is not always the case with a lot of the economic inequality data that we may discuss in public debates. What we do find is, so through this systematic assessment of globalization in terms of economic inequality, is a relatively important rise of global income inequality between individuals. The top 1% at the global level captured twice as much global income growth as the bottom 50% since 1980, despite strong growth in Asia, despite strong growth in China, in India. Now, the other key message here is that looking at the inequality trends and the policy process within countries, and I won't have much time to go into the details of what is happening in the different countries that we focus on in the report. So if you're interested, I invite you to look at the report. It's also available online in its full version in several languages. We highlight the importance of institutional and political changes to account for this rise of inequalities rather than deterministic forces. So this is a suggestion that much more can indeed be done in order to promote more equitable growth pathways. All right, so this presentation will follow more or less the structure of the report. First, a few words on the project. Then I look at global income inequality dynamics. Then in parts 3 and 4 at global wealth inequality dynamics, and then I will conclude. So the WIDWorld project and the measurement of economic inequality actually relies on the work of pioneering researchers, Simon Kuznets in the 1950s, Tony Atkinson and Alan Harrison at the end of the 1970s, which use tax data to track systematically income for Kuznets and wealth inequality for Atkinson and Harrison. And it is actually based on these pioneering methods that Thomas Piketty comes in the early 2000s with his work on top incomes in France since the 19th century, top wealth owners in France as well. Then Emmanuel Saez comes in, and the historical series on US top income inequalities are produced in 2003. So updating basically the work of Kuznets and providing a new perspective of this famous Kuznets curve. So with this now well-known rising inequality trend since the end of the 1970s. So After this first set of research, of data production, more countries are added to the project. The countries are included in the Atkinson and Piketty volumes in 2007, 2010. And in 2011, the website, the World Top Income Database, is created with the idea to put this online so that there can be easy access to the data by researchers, by journalists, by different communities. And so this is 2011, and there is a nice synergy at that time with the publication of Capital in the 21st Century, 2013 in French, 2014 in English, which largely relies on this set of information. The publication of Capital in the 21st Century and the debates that surrounded it were also very interesting for this project because they came along with a set of remarks, comments, or criticisms. One of them was the fact that there was an important focus on the Western world and very few data on emerging developing countries. A second remark was a strong focus on the top 1%. What was happening to the bottom 99% or the bottom 90% of the population? Well, in fact, the limitations of the book and of the database at the time were not because of a will to limit to this scope, but rather the limitation of the data at the time. And the debates which surrounded the publication of the book actually helped us in a lot of countries to access new types of data. This was particularly the case in India, for instance, where it is debates with actually the Indian government after the publication of Capital in the 21st Century, debates in the media that helped us to actually access tax data that had not been released since the 2000s in this country. So the other interesting development over the past 4 or 5 years is to move from a focus on top income shares and top wealth shares to having a support of the full distribution, which is now what we look at. So this requires a combination of survey data with tax data. And the idea here is really to use national accounts, tax data, survey data in a systematic manner in order to distribute national income. And this is what we've been doing over the past years, and this is what we are presenting in this first World Inequality Report. Then a third development is the introduction of more wealth distributions, thanks to the release of more data. But as you will see, for wealth, we have much less information at this stage than for income. And we feel that we're not ready to produce global wealth inequality estimates because the level of opacity is too high at this stage. So at the moment, we cover about 80 countries in terms of income inequality series, 30 countries for wealth, and we also have a series of macroeconomic data for 190 countries. Again, really one of the main objectives of the project is to provide everything online. So all the set of computer codes are available in a few clicks online, which allow interested researchers to actually modify certain assumptions if they will. And you can also have access to all the data directly from Stata, from R packages, along with a series of online tools that we discussed with the PhD students earlier today that can allow interested researchers to manipulate distributions directly online. All right, so let's start with the results on the income inequality part. Just one word on why do we think that we need to use this tax data when it's available? Well, because official data on inequality mostly relies on self-reported surveys, which generally underestimate inequality because of misrepresentation of top income of top wealth owners. So we see this work on a global distribution of income based on this systematic combination of tax and survey data as The first combination that is consistent with national accounts, and we confirm and amplify earlier results on this topic, including the now well-known elephant curve pattern of Chris Lackner and Branko Milanovic. But we have a much finer representation of what is happening at the very top of the distribution, and we're coherent with national accounts data, meaning that we're coherent with the growth rates that we actually observe in the countries. Right, so this is a snapshot of the situation in 2016. So that's the top 10% national income share across the world. In Europe, China, Russia, US, Canada, Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, India, and the Middle East, with the top 10%, the top 10% capturing 37% of total income in Europe. On the left-hand side, 61% for the top 10% in the Middle East, and a variety of situations in between. Where do we come from? So we start in the report in 1980, since this is a date for which we're able to have distributions for all these regions. And it is also indeed a major economic policy turnaround moment. So we start from a situation in 1980 with a relatively low inequality level in all these regions, with US, Canada, Europe, India, China having top 10% income share around 30%, and relatively important rise in all these countries afterwards, but at different speeds. So if we take the extreme case of Russia, for instance, in purple here, it's the most equal country in the subset in 1990, and in just 5 years, it becomes the most unequal country. This very striking, very rapid rise of inequality in Russia can also help us understand perhaps the will for stability in this country afterwards. Other trajectories which are striking, the very neat progressive rise in the US, in Canada, the very strong rise in India, and then on the other end of the spectrum, Europe having a rise in inequality, but that is much more moderate than other countries. And China, I will come back on this, a stabilization of inequality since the mid-2000s. So now if we look at these countries from a broader historical perspective, well, 1980 is the end of a period of reduction of inequality that broadly lasted from the 1920s to the 1970s. Under very different political or economic systems, so whether socialism, communism, or mixed economy in the Western countries, or highly regulated economy in India. But whatever the political economic system, compression of income and of wealth inequality in these regions. After that, there's an important rise, and then the question we may ask ourselves is, where is this going to? Where maybe the new equilibrium? So let's just add three regions to this graph. So here you see the Middle East, Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa appear at the top of the graph. Unfortunately, we don't have data that's detailed enough from 1980 to 1980 to present here, but the key message here is that these countries are characterized by extremely high levels of inequality, and seemingly did not go through this phase of compression of inequalities from the 1920s to the 1980s. So they may be characterizing what we've called here a high inequality frontier, and we may wonder whether those countries which went through inequality compression are going back to this level. But before going back to discussing a bit more future trends, let's do another exercise, which is to break national boundaries between these countries and look at what happens to global inequality between world individuals, as if countries did not matter. So this is the result of this exercise. So what we do here is that we divide the world into 100 income groups, 100 percentiles. We sort them from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right, and we plot the real income growth rate per adult from 1980 to today. We indeed observe strong income growth at the bottom of the distribution, so around 100% income growth for the bottom 40% of the distribution. So this is indeed the rise of emerging countries. Much slower growth rate for the upper half of the distribution, with a squeezed bottom 90% of the US and of Western Europe, so with growth rates lower than 50%. And we'll see later, and as you know, the bottom 50% in the US indeed grew at rates that are even much lower than 50%, closer to 0% actually. And then if we go to the right-hand side of the graph, we see very important, very high growth rates, the top 1% rising at 200% over the period. So one question we may ask ourselves at this stage is, does this really matter? What is happening at the very top? In the end, it's just 1% of the population, so they may be growing at a very high growth rate, but this may not matter that much from a macroeconomic point of view. So what we do is we use exactly the same data, but we plot it slightly differently. So here the x-axis is scaled on the population basis. So that is each group of equal population size gets a segment that is equal. Now what we do on this graph is that we give to each group a length that is proportional to the fraction of total growth that this group captured since 1980. So the top 1% on the previous graph is so just equal to 1 dot, whereas on this new graph, the top 1% represents 27% of the axis because it captured 27% of total growth. And this is to be compared to what happened to the bottom 50% of the global income distribution, which captured actually only 12% of total growth. So the answer to the question I was raising earlier is yes, what happened at the very top matters from a macroeconomic point of view, because the top 1% captured twice more growth than the bottom 50% at the entire half poorest half of the world's population. So this is one of the key results of this report. So this is problematic, but let's do an exercise. The idea here is to show, and you may see this even if it's reversed. The green line shows the evolution of the Gini coefficient of global inequality since 1980, and you see that it's more or less straight, so it's more or less flat basically. And in fact, this is one of the stories that we generally hear about global inequality, that we fail to see an important rise in global inequality. And in fact, if you look at the Gini coefficient, we don't see much evolution. But we believe that the Gini coefficient actually hides a lot of the dynamics that has been taking place over the past decades. And what I was showing on this graph is actually the ratio of the average income of the top 10% to that of the middle 40%, and the ratio of the average income of the middle 40% of the global distribution to that of the bottom 50%. And this is when you see these two diverging trends that appear that actually help us relativize this stability of global inequality since 1980. Behind the veil of the Gini, a lot of action is taking place, which we may not be able to visualize properly with this composite indicator, which can be interesting and useful for many purposes. But This is why we also like to use bottom 50%, middle 40%, or top 10% shares, because we think that it's better to represent dynamics, the dynamics of the distribution. So here again, this is this inverted graph. All right. Another question that may arise is, are we sure that this enormous rise of the global 1% was necessary for the growth of the bottom 50% of the distribution? And well, the answer is no. We're not really sure at all that this rise was necessary. At least when we look at the dynamics within countries, we see that it is possible to combine higher growth with lower inequality. And this is pretty apparent when we compare Europe with the US or China with India, which is what I'm about to do. So what we plot here is top 1% income share in the US in red versus bottom 50% income share in the US in blue from 1980 to 2016. Similar indicators for Western Europe over the period. And you see the complete reversal of the relative positions of the top 1% versus the bottom 50% in the US over time. Top 1% rising from 10 to 20%, more or less. The reverse for the bottom 50%. Whereas in Western Europe, the top 1% rises from 10% to about 12% over the period. There's a slight decline of the bottom 50%, but a much more moderate rise in inequality. When we look at China versus India, we see relatively similar dynamics at the beginning of the period up to the 2000s, and then a stabilization in China versus a continuation of the trend in India over the past 10 to 15 years. What is interesting in these comparisons, which indeed have many limitations, but we here compare countries that have similar levels of development, relatively similar size or exposure to globalization and to new technology since the 1980s, but radically diverging inequality trajectories. So it is hard to use the explanation of technology or trade to account for these radically diverging inequality trends. And we discuss in the report more at length the impact, the importance of less progressive taxation schemes, unequal access to education, falling minimum wage in the USA to account for the difference with what happened in Western Europe. In China, where we see lower growth of inequality since the mid-2000s, indeed, strong investments in education, health, infrastructure, as relatively speaking to what happened to India, help us account for this moderation of inequality since the mid-2000s. Now, just one point here. In 2015, all countries actually agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals. One of these goals, so that's target 10.1, which stresses that in all countries, the bottom 40% should grow at a rate that is faster than the average. Well, none of these countries since the 1980s actually met these goals. So this is it for the income inequality part. Now, if we move on to the wealth part, and I'll be shorter on this part, but let me just introduce this by saying that the division between the ownership of capital between the private sector and the public sector is indeed an important dimension of inequality, and it has been relatively overlooked over the past decades. We discuss a lot in public debates about private debt, public debt, as if debt actually belonged to planet Mars. But indeed, there are individuals behind debt, and we feel it's important to actually relate this macroeconomic debate on capital to microeconomic statistics, microeconomic data. So part 3 of the report is on this basic division between private wealth public wealth. And part 4 is really about wealth inequalities between individuals. What we show here is that large transfers of public to private wealth occurred in nearly all countries, whether rich or emerging. And there is a strong decline, historic decline in public wealth, which is now negative or close to zero in several countries. So this graph, some of you may have already seen it in part in Capital in the 21st Century. The report actually updates the graph. So what you see here is private capital at the top expressed as a percentage of national income. So 300% private capital in 1970 in the UK means 3 years equivalent of national income as a stock of private capital. This rises to about 600% today. What we see is that the impact of the financial crisis in some countries, the UK, in the US is a blip, but that's only temporary. We're back on the long-term trend afterwards. Similar remark for the bubbles in Spain, in Japan, which burst, but which do not importantly affect the long-term trend. The symmetry of this reality of a rise of private capital is this decline of public capital. So about 70% of national income in rich countries in 1970 to 0%, a bit more than 0% in France, in Japan, in Germany, and below 0% in the UK or in the US. So here we're defining capital as the sum of financial and non-financial assets, financial and non-financial public assets minus debts. So what does it mean? A country that has minus zero public capital, it's a country in which if the government wanted to repay all its debts by selling all its assets, it would sell all its public infrastructure. It would not even be able to repay its debt. And that citizens of that country would then have to pay a rent to all the new owners of all the roads, all the education system, all the administration infrastructure that exists in the country. So this graph adds China in the picture so as to have an insight into what is happening in emerging countries. Here the scale is different. So we're expressing public wealth as a share of total wealth. So in 1978 in China, 70% of total wealth is public. So by definition, 30% is private. And what is interesting here is that China actually stabilizes its public wealth level more or less at the level that we observed in rich countries, in Western countries during their mixed economy period. That is around 30%. So the fourth part of the report is really about the combination of the results that we find in this income inequality part that I discussed previously and the one which I just discussed. So these large transfers of public wealth to private wealth, this strong rise of private wealth in these countries, along with strong income inequality, at least in the US and in China, contributed to a steep rise in wealth inequality since the 1980s. But again, this rise in wealth inequality happened at different speeds. As you see on this graph, so this is the top 1% personal wealth share in emerging and rich countries. So much longer time span here. We're starting in the early 20th century. We see the steep rise in the US, steep rise in China, in Russia, much more moderate increase in France and the UK, and we argue that this is partly due to the moderating impact of housing prices. The middle class had a lot of housing assets, so So the price evolutions on this sector contributed to moderate the increase of the top 1% relative to the middle class in the UK and in France. So let me conclude with a few projections, and again with this general question, which is between these two forces that have an impact on global inequality, that is, on the one side, between country convergence, that tends to reduce global inequality, and on the other side, within country divergence, so the rise of inequalities within countries, which one will prevail in the future? The answer is we don't know, but we can make projections. And in our projections, we have a central scenario, which is business as usual. That is, we suppose that in all countries, from today to 2050, growth is distributed in the same way as it has been distributed since 1980. But then we use OECD growth projections for these countries. So, and we're actually even more optimistic than the OECD. That is, we assume that there will be strong growth in China, there will be strong growth in India, so lower growth in China than in the past 20 years, but still relatively high growth. Strong growth in India, strong growth in Africa, strong growth in Latin America. And even with these optimistic assumptions on total growth, in our business as usual scenario, we find a rise of the top 1% and a stability of the bottom 50% income share. So what this graph shows is the top 1% in red from 1980 to 2016. So that's the observed situation. And in red, this is the benchmark scenario. And two variants here. What happens if all countries distribute income growth in the way the US has distributed growth over the 1980-2016 period? So in that case, the top 1% would rise at an even higher level. So instead of 24% for the top 1%, we would reach 27%, 28%. What happened if all countries followed an EU trajectory? So in that case, we see a slight reduction of the top 1% income share, but still, we're very far from convergence between the top 1% and the bottom 50% income shares. Let me skip this graph and stop now. So the report also has a full section on what options are there to limit inequality. I think I leave this for the discussion if there are questions related to that. Really, the idea of the report is not to close the discussion. It's really to open it. So let me conclude by just saying these three key messages. It's really a collective work, which main objective is to feed public debates with transparent and systematic data. We find an important increase in global inequality between world individuals since the 1980s. But we also stress the importance of these diverging trends between countries, which show that different types of policies can be implemented to promote more equitable growth pathways, and this is discussed more at length in the report. Thank you very much for listening.
An amazing presentation, if mostly very frustrating in terms of the results. In terms of where we're going and where we might be headed. It's in terms of all the wealth of information you've presented. Some of this reinforces a lot of things that you and your colleagues have been doing before, and some of the conventional wisdom about the rise in within country inequality, and certainly in the United States and some but not all European countries. The rise in wealth inequality. In other respects, there's some new things here which lead me, at least me, to revise some of my priors about the evidence. So there's at least a couple of things there that I want to ask you about. One is with respect to, probably the most important one is with respect to the finding on the trend in global inequality. Now you emphasize this, that a lot of the discussion on inequality has had a kind of a pushback with people saying, look, what really matters is global inequality, that we should perhaps not be so concerned about rising inequality in places like the United States, where, after all, even the poor in the United States are relatively rich relative to most people in the rest of the world. And we should be more concerned about what happens to incomes at the very bottom of the global distribution, which is incomes in the developing countries, in the low-income countries. And that when you look at global distribution, the conventional wisdom has held that global inequality has actually fallen. And that's driven largely by the fact that China, East and Southeast Asia, and more recently India have grown very rapidly, and that's where a lot of very poor people in the world are. Now, you started in your introductory comments, you actually made a statement that completely reverses that conventional wisdom. You said that global inequality has increased since 1980. And later on, you clarified that actually it matters a lot how you're looking. If you're looking at the global inequality in the sense of the ratio of incomes at the very bottom relative to the middle, there, in fact, inequality has fallen because people at the very bottom of the global income distribution in the developing countries have done relatively well. But if you look at the top 1% relative to the middle of the distribution, inequality has worsened. The Gini coefficient, which is probably the one that we would have used most frequently before this work on top incomes, that seems to be flat. So I wanted you to say a little bit more about this, and in particular to help us understand where this difference between, because prior to your work, the global Gini would have shown a decline. And so if you can say a little bit more about sort of where exactly this difference is coming from. Is it sort of mostly the top 1%? Where do we go from the national surveys-based data, which previously Milanovic and the World Bank have used to do data that you're using to get us that difference?
Yeah, thanks a lot for asking me and asking us to clarify this very important point. I think first part, it's indeed important to distinguish between what has sometimes been called international inequality with global inequality. So international inequality between countries that has, so we see this convergence, at least Asian countries with rich countries. So we don't see convergence with, when you look at Africa vis-a-vis world average, African average income vis-a-vis world average. This is not converging. Latin American average vis-a-vis world average, this is not converging, but a strong convergence in Asia. So now what about global inequality, which we understand as inequality between world individuals? One source of variation with previous estimates based solely on survey data is what is happening in China and in India. So basically, survey data in India gives you a top, in China, sorry, gives you a top 1%, about 7, which is about, so the top 1% capture about 7% of total income today. There's a little evolution over the past decades. In our data, so which combines this survey data for the bottom of the distribution and uses tax data obtained from Chinese administrative sources, the top 1% rises from 7% in the 1980s to 14% today. So that's a huge rise in a country that matters a lot. In the case of India, the rise is also extreme. So we move on from a top 1% that is about 8%, 6% in the 1980s to a bit more than 20% today. And this is really not what you see in survey data. And so we're not claiming that our combination of tax data and survey data is perfect. Actually, it's far from perfect. But we feel that this is much more systematic, more robust, that is, it's better than what we had before. And so we would very much want to improve this, but at least this is much more precise than what happened than what was used before, and this contributes to explain some of the diverging trends that we had with the previous data and this new data. First point. Second, about the indicator. Well, the Gini indicator may have been used for many decades, but we feel that it may be time to use a dashboard of indicators. And this is also, the whole literature on national accounts and beyond GDP is also about now using a dashboard of indicators. The limit is that one indicator is more powerful in public debates, but it misses a lot of the dynamics. And the Gini, the aim of this graph, unfortunately, so next time, hopefully it will be reversed. It will be horizontal and not vertical. But the idea is to show that the Gini hides a lot of dynamics. And so, the top 1%, the top 10% had a strong increase since 1980. The bottom 50% had an increase relative to the middle class. But again, if you look at the bottom 50% share since 1980, it was stable. So we think it's more telling to look at these shares rather than one Gini indicator. And this is on this understanding, on this analysis of the data that we talk about this relatively important rise of global inequality. That being said, we see a reduction of the top 1% since the mid-2000s. Now the question is this a new normal? Are we going towards a further reduction? That's an open question.
Well, one other thing that may have been changed more recently is that you mentioned that Africa and Latin America, on average, have not been converging. But that's for the entire 1980 to 2016 period. Yes. But more recently, if you look at the last 15 years, there has been, I think, convergence there too. So that's, on the bottom, there might be a bit of a change too. But I wanted to ask you about, so another surprise is, so if you wanted to look for a part of the world where within country inequality has actually fallen, Latin America would have been that region because in fact, again, using traditional survey-based data, that within country inequality has tended to fall virtually in all Latin American countries as far as I know. Now, you cover Brazil at some length, and there you show that contrary to what the survey data shows, that in fact inequality has not fallen there. So I just wanted to bring that out as an interesting and novel part of your findings too. If you want to just say a little bit about Brazil, or perhaps more broadly about Latin America, because that goes against conventional wisdom.
So in the case of Brazil, we do observe this reduction in wage inequality in Brazil. You see a reduction of the top 1%, top 10% wage share in Brazil. But if you look not only at wages, but you also introduce capital income, you also introduce undistributed profits, which are a source of which should be seen as income. We see a stabilization of the top 1% and of the top 10% national income share in Brazil. We see a slight increase at the bottom and a compression of the middle class. So when you look at wage inequality data, we find what the surveys used to find, but introducing tax data and having this distributional national accounts methodology, yes, it changes the story. Now, we still have a lot of countries for Latin America that were not included in this report. And we are currently working on these countries, Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico, a lot of Latin American countries, and we'll be able to release this data soon. But so far, on the basis of surveys alone, we don't really know if this really pictures what is actually happening in these countries, even though, as we were discussing before, the relative quality of surveys in Latin America is much better than in many other emerging regions.
One of the most interesting charts in the report, and you showed it here, is the difference between the United States and Western Europe in terms of inequality trends, particularly if you just look at the top, what was it, the top 1%
Yep, yep.
versus the bottom 40%?
50. Yeah.
50. So the top 1% and the bottom 50%, you know, one is shooting up in the United States, the other is correspondingly falling. In Western Europe, those are relatively flat. So can you say a little bit more about, you mentioned those in passing, can you say a little bit more about the role of those, you know, sort of the policies, institutional factors, and you know, which you think are the most important in accounting for that difference?
If you allow me to show two slides on that, which are right here. So one of them is no, okay, so they're not. So here they are. So one is the tax story. So reduction in tax progressivity, which has been pretty strong, very apparent in the U.S. With an average, top marginal income tax of above 80% from the 1950s to the 1980s, and we go down to about 40% with planned reduction. So similar trajectory in the UK, and less decrease in France, in Germany, in continental European countries. But of course, tax progressivity is not the only story. It's part of the story. Another story, many of you know this famous graph. So Chetty, Hendren, Klein, and Saez graph on college attendance rate and parent income rank in the US. So for children born in 1980, 1982, you really see this, almost perfect regression line between the share of children who attend college between age 18 and 21, and so about 25% for the lower ranked, for the parents at the bottom of the income distribution, and close to 100% at the top. So that's, another story. In Germany, access to higher education is free. In France, it's nearly free. In Scandinavian countries, it's free and you get subsidies. So of course, this contributes to explain these differences. And then another key topic here is what happened to minimum wage. In the US, highest minimum wage in the rich world at the time, so in the 1960s, 70s. And today, it is 30% below that level of 1970s. And you see this strong rise in France or in other European countries. So these explain part of the story behind these strongly diverging trends.
When you mentioned free university education, I don't want our students to get the wrong idea here, but it's finally, before we turn to questions from the audience, can you say, given the new book that's coming out on the relationship between economic, social, and environmental inequalities, can you say a little bit about that?
So here we're looking at this strong rise in within country income and wealth inequality since the 1980s. The other key global challenge that happened since that period of time is the rise of CO2 emissions. And we also, I think, need to start to think about these two challenges in an integrated way. Because first thing, if you want to reduce international inequalities, what happened to global CO2 emissions? First point. But second point, if we want to reduce CO2 emissions, what kind of policies do we implement that do not contribute to a further rise of inequalities? Because there are many kinds of environmental policies, climate policies, that are not necessarily very good for low-income groups. Because the share of energy in the expenditures of low-income groups is higher than the share of energy in top-income groups' expenditures. So this also means that we need to think about the climate issue in a distributional way. And if we look at actually the distribution of global CO2 emissions, so this is a work that we did with Thomas Piketty in 2015. We looked at who emits in the world today not looking at countries, but at individuals. And we find that the top 10% contribute to about 50% of global emissions. And this is really not how the global climate change debate is structured. It's still really much structured around this Annexed 1, non-Annex 1 distinction that was introduced at the time of the Kyoto Protocol, so between industrialized countries of the time and non-industrialized countries of the time. But in this top 10% higher emitters at the global level, there's also already a lot of Chinese, a lot of Indians, a lot of elites from emerging countries. So this really also asks us to perhaps rethink the set of policy instruments that we're about to put in place or not about to put in place. Unfortunately, in some countries, this country is about to get out of the Paris Agreement. It's not yet out. I think there will be 1 or 2 days after the final day of this mandate of Donald Trump to reverse this decision, if ever another president is willing to do that and comes into power. But the point here is that we may want to start to think about climate policy instruments that take into account this huge level of economic inequalities, which translate into a huge level of pollution inequality at the global level.
We have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. If you have a question or comment, please introduce yourself first. Tell us who you are. There are microphones there and over there. So please start by telling us who you are.
Hello, my name is Sophie Dover. I'm a MPP, Master's in Public Policy candidate. It's like my first week here. I'm particularly interested in income inequality in the United States. And if you could be so bold, do you think there would be ways to incentivize the United States government to more readily regulate income inequality, and what types of policies do you think could bear fruit considering our political climate?
In about 2 minutes.
So again, I'll do a parallel with the climate policy. Our president, Emmanuel Macron, freshly elected, thought he was able to convince Donald Trump so that Donald Trump would not get out of the Paris Agreement. So he organized a big party at the Élysée, French presidential palace, and he invited Trump to our annual National Day. And then he thought he had convinced Trump not to get out of the Paris Agreement. And in the end, what happened is that the U.S. declared that it went out of the Paris Agreement. So I don't think it's possible to convince at all. But so in terms of the actual political climate, I'll stay out of this discussion. In terms of policy, I think it's fairly evident that the new tax package is going to turbocharge inequality. So billions and billions of dollars for the top 1%. Clearly, this is not going to invert the trend. It's going to emphasize it. So a new tax policy package, much more progressive, is one way to go. Minimum wage is also another way to go. And I think, more democratic access to education is also very important in this context. And there's interesting work done by Raj Chetty on the matter. And I think, these are at least 2 or 3 very important options for progressives in this country to pursue.
There's a question over there.
My name is Alex. I'm an econ student, and my question is, I'm very interested by these graphs that you show that put sort of global inequality on one axis and put individuals on the same scale regardless of currencies. But my understanding is that there are certain assumptions that go into that, and I was wondering if you could help me think through and maybe spell out, what happens when prices are very high in one country for some goods, but people don't necessarily buy those goods. What are the challenges involved in this, and what assumptions do you make when translating currencies and putting people on one scale?
So we do not invent anything on that. Basically, we do these graphs using purchasing power parity indices. So the latest round is the 2011 round. So you adjust the level of incomes to the level of prices in the country. If the prices are low, this will mean a high in purchasing power, reversely when the prices are high. But we also do this graph with market exchange rates. And the bottom line is that it doesn't change the general conclusions. So this is one way to to answer your question. And all these graphs are also available online. If you want the market exchange rates, you can have them. It's on the website.
Question?
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Jandos, University of Massachusetts, PhD student in economics too. Just a couple of questions. So first, you already mentioned it, but I will again want to hear from you again. So survey data, I don't believe they can capture top 1% of incomes or wealth. Tax data also, there are different top percentiles they can capture. So when you combine them together, how consistent is it? What are the limitations for people using your data? And just overall, just comment how can people combine survey data and tax data structures? Second is that you just world income inequality charts show top 10% and bottom 50%, right? Why don't just methodologically people don't show top 10 and bottom 10%? Why top 10 and 50%, bottom 50%? And third is emerging markets. The data starts from 1980s, and a lot of like China, Russia, India, they experienced change in political structure, economical structure. They went from communist economies to market economies. How consistent is this? Does it add like this converging trend too much to the picture, overall picture, since it's two different economies already? And there's too many questions, but one more is that
Maybe let's just
right.
keep it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. So for the combination of survey data and tax data, let's take the case of India, for example. Tax data covers about 6 to 7% of the population at the top. So indeed, in that case, you cannot only rely on tax data if you want to distribute the totality of national income and to know what is happening in the bottom 94, 93% of the population. So we have to combine the two. We are actually constructing new methods basically to reweight survey weights in a way that matches the information, the additional information provided in the tax data. This is not what we were doing before, even though the results are relatively similar. Now what we'll be able to do is to keep all the additional information from the survey data, so all the additional covariates that are, that's why survey were invented, right? To have all this additional socio-demographic information on households. What we used before was deleting this information, and we only had information on the distribution of income. So now we have this method to reweight the survey in a way that the income distribution is consistent with the information of the tax data and keeps the rest of the information. So that's one answer. The second, there were so many questions. So top 10, bottom 10. So the thing is, having said, this criticism on the Gini coefficient, we need to move to a dashboard, but we cannot show 10 indicators on one graph. So we need to find a good mix. And we think these three broad groups, bottom 50, middle 40, top 10, or top 1, is a good way to represent what's happening. But again, there's no perfect way to do it. On the website, you can do any kind of deciles, percentiles, any kind of group that you want, which is readily available from the website. And yeah.
Next question.
Hi, my name's Christine Dazan. I teach at the law school. And my question is really returning to Professor Rodrik's question about the forces that have produced these patterns. In particular, I'm wondering about the influence of financialization as one possible contributor to income inequality, especially in the United States. And I'm thinking about the impact on the divergence between the middle and the top of the income spread. Both thinking about work by people like Thomas Philippon and Greta Krippner that seem to show that there's increasing financial activity and income without increasing productivity because of financialization. And I'm thinking, second, about the kind of public spending and political energy that follows a financial crisis that could also be diverting public attention and or spending to the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, of course, mentioning this is it's an important part of the story. There's an interesting paper by Waldenstrom and co-author on financial Big Bang and the impact on top shares, looking at the case of the UK and of Japan. And they find that the financial Big Bang, so the rise of financialization in these two countries, account for, I think, just by memory, 1/3 of the rise in the top income shares in these two countries. So this is one part of the story that may help us understand also the difference between the Anglo-Saxon world and the Western continental European world. But again, we believe that we cannot. I mean, this would not be the main determinant of the trends that we observe.
There's also more broadly, there's another paper coming out of the IMF of all places that looks at the effect of opening up the the capital account that is entering financial globalization and top income shares. And there's a very striking positive correlation between opening up to external financial flows, financialization in that sense, and subsequent rise in top income shares across the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just take one little final question.
I'm Gilead. I'm a retired mathematician and a neighbor. So I'm interested. This is fascinating, but I'm interested in the undercurrents, what drives it, and it seems that there was a certain disappointment from the social policies since Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and it fuels it. But now there is this inequality is manifested in the refugee or the migration, the mass migration, which fuels further turn to the right, and it seems to spiral upwards. And this rise of neo-lib that feeds onto itself and the refugee that feeds nationalism and neo-lib, how do you see this process and hopefulness we should have to the future?
There may be sometimes two ways to explain political frustration and political cleavage, especially the one we're witnessing these days, the rise of populism, whether in the US or in Europe. One way would be to say, look, it's rising inequality that explains that. But then a criticism to that standpoint, which is, but actually a lot of people who are not losers of globalization, who actually have been benefiting from it over the past decades, are also showing extreme signs of frustration and maybe supporters of the far right. So then there's the extreme other, the reverse claim, which is it's only about racism and identity. And I think, you know, it's a complex integration of these two trends that may help us understand what is happening. But one thing is certain: if over the past 40 years the trends in terms of top 1% share hadn't been what they have been, and if the bottom 50% of that country had not benefited to near zero growth, it is for certain that the amount of frustration would be less, and the candidates for supporting these anti-migration politics would also be lesser. So of course the material dimension is important in this story, even though it doesn't in itself by itself is sufficient to explain the entire thing. Sorry?
Why the world would have been better?
Well, good point on which to end. There is a reception next door in the Allison dining room. Those of you who want to have more questions or want to meet our speaker, but let me close this by thanking very much Lucas Chancel for this wonderful presentation and the amazing, excellent work that you and your colleagues are doing. Thank you.